So this is Flash Techniques for Nature Photography, and I was putting this together for mainly for macro photographers and for bird photographers. I use Flash for both of those things, and it occurred to me that in order to talk about either one of those things, I need to talk about the basics of Flash photography. And when I'm talking about Flash photography, I mean speed lights, basically. I mean small flash that you can put in the hot shoe on top of your camera. That's the little folded metal piece on top of your camera that runs the flash. Um, I do use big lights as well and studio strobes, but that's not really what we're talking about. As a nature photographer and a workshop leader, I'm usually in the field. Usually, if I'm photographing, I am off somewhere. So I've had to carry everything that I'm using with me. And for me, the more that I can slim down my kit, the better, right? Um, that means I'm going to use a small flash like this Olympus FL700 WR versus carrying a big strobe or something like that. It also means for macro photography, I've got all sorts of things to show you, but I've got LED panels that I've used for macro photography before. There's things like the LumaCube and that kind of stuff. But the fact is, again, the less I can carry, the better. So if I can use one unit, if I can use one speed light for macro photography, for adding fill flash to my bird photography, for anything else I want, and not have to carry anything else, that makes me happy, right? I've only got to carry one set of batteries or one charger. All that stuff adds up when you're talking about carrying electronics. And I know from my experience as an instructor, flash tends to be the biggest mystery to most photographers. And I was the same way at one point. And so I just set about I've got to learn how to do this. I've got to learn how to use light so I'm not so scared of it, because there's a lot of times. So, you get a flash because you're told that you need a flash. So you put it on top of the camera, you make a picture, it looks crappy, and then you take the flash off and put it back in your bag, right? I know a couple of you, like Martha, she's been on one of my Costa Rica workshops. And in my experience, as far as class sessions and that kind of thing, the training that I do using small flash is among the most valuable to people. That's the thing that at the end of the week, people are like, wow, I had no idea how to do that. And now I'm going to use that for my bird photography. So I know it can be helpful for you. And hopefully this class will do that for you. So we're going to talk about the basics of flash, about how to adjust flash, how to add flash into your exposure. Most of what we're doing with flash is usually not using flash as a main light. As a nature photographer, as an outdoor photographer, I'm generally going to be using flash as a fill light to the ambient light. The exception to that is with macro photography. A lot of the times I'll use flash as the main light, and then the ambient light becomes my fill light. Okay. And all these things will be explained in great detail over the next 45 minutes to an hour. So I'm also going to talk about some modifiers. And a flash modifier is simply something you put in front of the light that changes the personality of the light. Sometimes it changes the color or the shape, or in the case of a flash extender, it's going to change the range of your flash. Basically, a little speed light has a pretty limited range. They're not really built to throw light very far. So when we're using flash for fill light with nature subjects, a lot of times we want to be able to throw that light farther. So we're going to need to modify the light. And so then we're going to be getting into the specifics. Once you understand how to control the exposure with flash, then applying that knowledge to macro subjects and to wildlife subjects is relatively easy. If you're starting from scratch and you don't know how flash works, then yes, it becomes a big challenge to, okay, how do I throw light 100 feet into that tree to add fill light to this bird? If you don't even know how to throw light 10 feet, then it's going to be a real challenge to throw it that far, right? So a few things to keep in mind with speed lights and with light in general. we're going to be talking about light in the same way that I talk about aperture or shutter speed or ISO. We work in stops, right? And a stop of light is either twice as much or half as much light, depending on which way you go. So that makes it really easy to balance exposure with flash. If I change the aperture one stop, I can change my flash one stop as well and get the same exposure, right? That makes it very easy. You don't have to do any sort of different math when we're talking about using light. The other thing that I'm going to be talking about mainly today is using manual mode on your flash. Now, that means that you're going to be in charge of the output power of your flash. And every flash has some way of changing the power, whether it's some electronic thing that has buttons and dials on the back. I got this out just for fun. My Vivitar 285, $50 flash. This is what I started with. So you don't have to have fancy gear for this. There are manual flashes, Chinese flashes, the Godox Speedlights that I know a lot of people are very happy with, and you can get one of those for, under $100, well under $100. And as far as I know, they work just fine. So I wanted to put this class together so that whatever unit you're using, whatever type of a speedlight you're using, then you can follow along with this. And I also recommend that you do learn how to use manual flash. You learn how to use manual exposure, manual flash, so that you can drive the bus, right? So that way, if at some point you're using TTL flash, which is the automatic flash, so the TTL stands for through the lens. Okay, so if you want to use automatic flash, then you'll understand what's happening with that flash exposure to camera exposure conversation. I think it's the same thing if you want to shoot in aperture priority mode or shutter priority mode on your camera, then that becomes easier if you know how to shoot in manual mode. So you understand, the computer is helping you, right? The computer in your camera or the computer in your flash is helping you get your exposure. But if you know where you're trying to go, then that becomes a little easier to manage, right? The flash that I use is I mentioned the Olympus FL700WR. I do like it because it's small. I like it because it's waterproof too. I work in a lot of places where it rains a lot, Costa Rica, the Amazon River in Peru and that kind of thing. The last thing I want to worry about is having water splash on my equipment. So I use this weather sealed unit and it works great. And it interfaces with my Olympus camera smoothly. And I'll show you some other accessories that go with that as well. I do use TTL flash, and what TTL stands for, as I mentioned, is through the lens. So what happens with TTL flash is as you press the shutter release button, the flash will fire a measuring blast of light. Okay, the light will reflect back in the camera through the lens. That's why it's called TTL. The camera will see how much light is output from the flash, and then it will decide how much light the flash needs to add for the actual exposure. So when you're using TTL flash, the flash actually goes off twice. Depending on the unit, sometimes it's a very fast, like pow kind of a thing, and sometimes I've had some units that you hit the button and it goes flash, flash. It's so slow that it's really unusable for nature photography. If you're doing, portraiture or something like that, it's fine. But honestly, this Olympus unit has the fastest TTL metering flash that I've used. And so I actually use that for wildlife photography quite often because it does work fast enough for me to use. That's, in my experience, that's kind of rare. But all that to say, I use both. I know how to use manual flash. I know how to use TTL flash. The benefits of using the automatic flash are the same as using, say, aperture priority mode in the camera. If you're working in a situation where the light is changing rapidly, or your subject might be changing rapidly, or maybe the distance to your subject is changing, it can be really cumbersome to try to change all of your exposure, all of your settings manually. So if you can use the computer in your camera and your flash to help you make that exposure and be more flexible, then that can be a real help, and you'll actually get shots sometimes that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So my recommendation is to do all of these things. Learn the manual flash, learn how to set the exposure, how to again integrate flash exposure into your photography, and then if you want to explore the TTL, then you'll know what it's doing and what it's not doing and kind of how it works. So with manual flash, the aperture and the ISO are going to control your exposure, right? Just like normal. If you change the ISO setting or the aperture setting, it's going to change both the background exposure, which we refer to as the ambient light, and it's going to change the flash exposure. Now, what's interesting to note with flash is that your shutter speed will not affect your flash exposure. So if you get your exposure like you want it, but you want the background darker, you can change, raise your shutter speed and change the background brightness without changing the brightness of your flash exposure. So that can be really handy. Now, when it comes to shutter speed, every camera has what's called the sync speed. Okay, that's the fastest shutter speed that you can use that your camera will synchronize with the flash. And if you go faster than your sync speed, then basically the light from your flash is not going to hit the entire frame in the time it takes for your shutter to open and close. So you'll get maybe a black bar on part of your frame. The flash is just not going to work. Now, there's pretty much every camera I know of has a high-speed sync mode. That works with shutter speeds faster than your sync speed. Now, the sync speed on my cameras is 250th of a second. That's average, 200 to 250th of a second. That can be kind of limiting if you're working outdoors in broad daylight and say you want to underexpose the ambient light and use the flash as your main light. That can be kind of restrictive, especially if you're shooting wildlife. Say if you're trying to freeze hummingbirds flying, you're not going to freeze anything at 250th of a second. So you can use high speed sync, and that will allow the camera to synchronize with your flash at speeds above your sync speed. Now, that does usually come with reduced power. Okay, that's reduced power output because the flash actually strobes very fast, like so fast you can't see it, in order to cover the entire frame of your picture. So in that, you don't get one powerful burst of light, you get several smaller bursts of light. So you are working with reduced power. And usually that means a reduced working range too, or reduced working distance from your flash. So I'm going to focus on regular sync speed, just sort of normal flash here. In my experience, to try to use high-speed sync with wildlife, you get the same problems that I mentioned when using TTL flash. You've got this flash going off in a sequence, and so you're not actually going to freeze the motion that way. It doesn't work. In my experience, it doesn't work very well for that. So I'm going to stick with pretty conventional flash here. This is going to be what I would love for you to know when this is over is how you can set a flash. If you get a manual camera and a manual flash, like, crank up your Vivitar 285 and you can make a picture using these techniques that I'm going to tell you. Okay. I think if you can start at the beginning, then it just is that much easier. Right. So if you are using TTL flash and you understand manual, then let's say you want to get more power out of your flash, then you can open up your aperture because the aperture makes the exposure brighter. You can raise your ISO because that makes the camera more sensitive to light and you don't need as much power out of your flash. So that's an example of why I recommend using the manual mode and before you try the semi-automatic modes or the TTL flash. What I'm going to do is basically talk through the process for how I would set a flash exposure. So the first thing I've got here is just the ambient exposure. Okay. And for this, all of these exercises, I'm using manual exposure mode in the camera. So I'm controlling the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO. And for this first session, I'm using manual on the flash. So this first exposure is just for the ambient light, right? This is just the light falling on my beautiful model here. And what I recommend when I'm starting with flash settings, I'm going to start with sort of middle of the road settings. Okay. What that means in this case, I've got f5.6 on an f2.8 lens. Okay. So I can either open up or I can stop down. Now, in this case, the light is pretty bright, so I'm pretty close to my sync speed at a 200th of a second, but that's okay for me right now. My ISO is at 400. That is pretty much, if I'm going to use flash, I'm going to start with ISO 400 and a mid-range aperture, so that way I have room to adjust up and down. Okay, so this is just the base exposure, no flash, no nothing. And so the next thing I'm going to do is turn my flash on, and I'm in manual mode on the flash, and I've got it set to 1/4 power. One of the things when you start using a Speedlight, one of the things you'll realize is that you hardly ever use full power on a Speedlight. If you're using it to light a person, you're normally around a 1/4 power, so a fourth of the actual maximum output. And this is a great example. The flash is at a 1/4 power. Okay. Now on these slides, you'll notice at the bottom left there, I've got the exposure settings, and the thing that changes, whatever changes on that slide from the previous slide, I've put in sort of reddish orange, so you can pick up on that and hopefully follow along with no sweat. So my ambient exposure didn't change, but I've added flash to it. Okay. So look at the background, look at the green grass in the background. Here's my ambient exposure, and here's my flash. So that background doesn't change when I add the flash, right? My exposure is still f5.6 at a 200th of a second at 400th of a second. So obviously that's too much flash, right? That looks terrible. This is what you get sometimes when you just put the flash on auto and see what happens. So the first thing I'm going to do is stop down the aperture. Okay, I mentioned the aperture and the ISO control both the ambient exposure and the flash. So I have too much flash, so I can pull my aperture down, right? So now I've stopped down to f11. And that's great. That gets my flash pretty much where I want it, maybe 2 stops under that 1/4 power that I was getting to begin with. Now you see I haven't changed anything except the aperture, right? So if I just change the aperture, that's going to change the entire exposure for the flash and the ambient. Now the trouble with that in this case is, what if I don't want to change the depth of field? The depth of field between f5.6 and f11 is quite a bit different, right? I've got the grass kind of nicely out of focus here, and I'm bringing that a little bit too much detail into the background. So just like handling the exposure that you would otherwise, I'm going to change one of the other points of the exposure triangle. And the exposure triangle being the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed. So I'm going to put my f-stop back at 5.6, and I'm going to lower my ISO, the same 2 stops, okay? Because I know that flash is 2 stops brighter than I want it to be. So again, I've got the exact same exposure. I'm going to go back to the shot with the aperture change. The exposure is the same, but look at the background. There's a little more detail there at f11, and now I can shoot at f5.6, get the exact same exposure, but I can get the depth of field that I want, that limited depth of field. Okay. So now I'm going to watch what happens when I open the shutter speed. Watch what happens to the owl when I change the shutter speed. Not one thing happened to the owl. That didn't change at all because the shutter speed doesn't affect the flash exposure. Okay. That flash is going off far faster than a 250th of a second. So your shutter speed is basically irrelevant when it comes to flash, as long as you're working below your sync speed. So the flash exposure brightened the ambient light, but the flash exposure doesn't change. So watch the owl here. I'll go back to the previous slide. The owl is there, and the exposure on the owl is exactly the same. The difference may be the fill light, the ambient light will be coming into that exposure a little more, but the flash exposure doesn't change. So now I'm going to kind of dial this in, and I raise the shutter speed up 1 stop to darken the background. Again, I change the shutter speed. The background goes from there to there. I like it. I've got the depth of field that I want at f5.6, so my background is nice and blurred. I've got the amount of light that I wanted on the owl, and I'm basically just balancing the light, right? I don't want it to look like a flash picture. I just want the exposure to be what I want. Okay, that is how you do it. In a nutshell, that's how. If you go out and practice that with your flash and your camera, just practice that. Get the hang of it. Change the shutter speed to change your ambient light. Change aperture of the ISO to entire exposure, including your flash. That's as easy as it is. If you get the hang of that, then you've got the hang of anything else. It's just a matter of technique in those other areas. So what about changing the flash? In my experience with clients, normally the first thing that people want to do is grab the flash and change the power output from the flash, right? And that makes sense. The flash is too bright. I'm going to change the exposure on the flash. But you can see here, we can change the exposure triangle and adjust the flash as well. But here's the original exposure with the flash dialed down the same 2 stops. Works exactly the same. The exposure on the owl is the same, right? Because we've adjusted our exposure for the flash, and now we've adjusted the flash for the exposure. So it's basically 2 ways of going about the same exact thing. And so if you turn your flash down to this and you want the background darker, then you can simply make your shutter speed a little faster and your background will get darker, right? This is the part of online training that kind of trips me out because I can't see everybody going, oh yeah, okay, cool. So I hope everybody's getting this. If not, then this is the time to hit the Q&A. I'm trying not to go too fast. I wanted to show you too what happens with the TTL exposure. I've heard a lot of instructors for a long time say things like, you never want to have you never want to let the camera decide anything because it always makes the wrong choice. And I can tell you that's not true. Sometimes the camera makes exactly the right choice and it works great. And a good TTL system, I know when I was shooting Nikon, the TTL flash, the Nikon CLS flash works beautifully. When I was shooting Panasonic, the TTL flash works beautifully. The Olympus TTL exposure works beautifully. So there are definitely exceptions to that. It's not a you always want to turn the computer off in your camera. Sometimes the computer is pretty smart. And just for an example, here's our original exposure, our original ambient exposure of f5.6 at a 200th of a second at ISO 400. And all I did with the flash was turn it on, put it on TTL mode, right? Through the lens, automatic, and this is the exposure that it got. So here's what the camera thinks the exposure should be, and here's what I think the exposure should be. Pretty much exactly the same, right? It's when you get into great distance, when you get into different colors, when you get into particular instances that you really want to be driving the bus as far as the light goes. Not to mention it's super fun to be in total control of it. When you're shooting, when you're photographing birds, for example, you have to get yourself in exactly the right spot, get yourself in exactly the right light. If the sun goes behind a cloud, then it's your exposure is going to change, your contrast is going to change. Well, guess what? If you're driving the bus with your Speedlight, then you don't have to worry about that. Great photos are made in great light, and it's really nice to be able to bring that great light with you and design it however you like.